We're about to dive into the latest developments in the Delphi murder case. Richard Allen, convicted of the 2017 murders of teenagers Abigail Williams and Libby German, has recently filed a motion to correct errors, aiming to overturn his conviction. The motion highlights alleged prosecutorial missteps during the trial. Joining us to discuss is defense attorney and former prosecutor Eric Faddis. Eric, let's start with you. With your extensive experience in this area on both sides of the courtroom, how do such alleged errors impact the integrity of a conviction, and what sort of challenges do they present during the appeals process, which is now just beginning?
Certainly. No surprise here that they were going to do a motion for a new trial. That's pretty standard. Now, what they're alleging are substantive issues, meaning that there's new evidence that the jury may not have heard. They're also alleging these procedural missteps, like you mentioned, and also alleged prosecutorial misconduct. A court is going to look at this and they're going to try to determine, hey, were these errors, did they exist? And if so, were they so severe that but for those errors, a new outcome likely would have happened at the jury trial. That's really the central inquiry for the court on this motion.
And there's a lot of things in this inquiry to correct errors. The defense alleging that the prosecution allowed one of the witnesses, Brad Weber, to testify inaccurately about his arrival time at the home, which is critical to the case's timeline. If that's proven, that could undermine more of the credibility of the prosecution's timeline, and I suppose could impact the verdict. It's one of many things that the defense is saying was not accurate. What's your reaction to that?
Timelines are always very important, especially when we're trying to piece together what happened. And we're looking at a sequence of events. And so the prosecution says one thing, but especially they can present evidence, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But if they knowingly present evidence that is inaccurate, especially regarding a timeline, that can have bearing on an appeal. A judge could look at that and say, hey, look, this is so significant that we're going to overturn the case. I think that Richard Allen would need some additional evidence to reach that threshold, but this certainly gets him on that road.
There certainly is a lot that they're coming with, and we knew this would happen. We knew we'd end up going back to 2017. Specifically to some of those recordings that were made by the police when they were investigating initial suspects in this, or people of interest. And if you remember way back, this was a big deal. It never really got brought up in the trial because Gull didn't allow it to be brought up in the trial. But when the defense of Richard Allen requested, hey, we'd like to see those videos of these other people you interviewed, the response was, we can't give them to you. We accidentally recorded over them with new episodes of Magnum P.I. That's the problem. I mean, it wasn't Magnum. It was probably, I don't know, Teletubbies or something. But the fact that it's gone, and these recordings, they say, there was nothing to them anyhow. I mean, how do we know that? How can law enforcement just throw that out there like there's nothing to see here, and we're just supposed to take their word for it? I mean, we had to back then, and now it's coming up for appeal. I mean, this is a big thing. If you have other people on camera, especially others who might have done this, who were in the place, tend to have a little bit more evidence against them as well, but nothing to see here. How is that going to play out in court? How are they going to make sense of this in an appeals court?
What we're kind of talking about is potentially withholding or destroying possibly exculpatory information and evidence. So exculpatory means it tends to show the innocence of the defendant. And when the courts look at this, they don't just take the government's word for it. They don't just say, oh, the government says that it wasn't helpful for the defense, so that's fine. The government doesn't get to decide. The court is going to look at this hopefully with a more neutral lens and hear the defense out. If defense can show reasons why they believe that this evidence would have been exculpatory and tending to show innocence, and if we're talking about interviews with alternative suspects, certainly there's information their defense could have used, that's going to weigh heavy on the court's mind in deciding these motions for a new trial.
There has been other people who have allegedly made claims that they were responsible for this crime. There are other people who are dead, who could have played a big role in this crime, but we can't go back to them now because, well, they're not around. For example, the owner of the property where the girls were found, he's gone now. Another one of the other interesting characters in this, Keegan Kline, he's not dead, but he's in prison now for quite a long time because he was downloading child porn on his computer. And there's even allegations that he was going to go and meet one of the girls the very day they were murdered, and allegedly had been communicating with one of them digitally for quite some time. All of these things never introduced into the actual case itself. Now, I'm sure if it goes back to Gull, it's going to sit where it is. Is another court, an appeals court, how are they going to look at this? And are they going to see it from the same perspective as Gull, as the rest of us on the outside are going, this seems like it's kind of big?
Yeah, critical question. I think we're beginning to get to the crux of this appeal. And so this motion for to correct errors is going to first go to Judge Gold. And it's kind of weird because you're telling the judge, hey, these errors were made and you sort of presided over these. And so you should reverse course and say you were wrong. And judges aren't inclined to do that. But Judge Gold does not have the final say. It will go from there to an appellate judge who is supposed to review from a neutral, impartial perspective, what Judge Gold did and whether these errors were so significant that they could have resulted in a different outcome in the trial. And when we're talking about alternative suspects that the jury didn't get to hear and compelling information that ties them to the case, I think that is probably Richard Allen's strongest ground for appeal.
There's also now in the new filings and the errors, they're pointing out that there was a confession made several years ago. They don't list who made the confession, but the confession involves a box cutter, and apparently never really investigated all that much, just like a lot of other pieces of this case seem to not be investigated all that much. What kind of weight does that have on an appellate court? I mean, and how much are they going to look at that, and how much can they pull from that to see really did the investigators do their job, or are they just going to have to kind of take the words of the investigators as, basically the Bible? This is what it is. There's no questioning it, and we did our best, and our investigation pointed to Richard Allen despite us not looking at all of these things. How does a court break that down once an investigation really has already been done?
Yeah, a court is not going to police the police investigation. They're not necessarily going to say, "Oh, well, I think you didn't follow up here where you should have, and I think you should have done better on this ground or whatever." That's probably not what a court's going to do. But they are going to look at what did the government, including the police, do to handcuff the defense's ability to show the defense's innocence. And if that is there was this other confession, but we don't have names, we don't have times, we don't have places, we don't have information the defense could have used to follow up on, that's significant. Now, the court might also look at the defense and say, hey, why didn't you do more about this? And that will depend on when the defense found out about this. To me, that's unclear. But certainly the confession from somebody else is critical, and the jury should have heard about it.
And it's easy for me, a layman on the outside, to go, this doesn't make a lot of sense. You're an attorney. You've seen both sides of this. What are the legal standards here for determining whether new evidence or errors are sufficient to warrant a retrial? And how do courts assess the potential impact of the evidence on the original verdict?
So typically, the standard to try to get a new trial in this appellate posture would be whether the errors were so significant that they could have led the jury, or it's reasonably likely they would have led the jury to render a different verdict. And so that's tough because it's hard to get into that jury's mind and say, hey, well, if you knew about this, would you have changed your decision? They don't go back to the jury and ask them that. So it's really the court sort of doing this reconstruction and going back in time and saying, hey, this from a legal perspective is so important that it would have caused a reasonable juror to do something different. And when we're talking about a confession from somebody else, that has that potential weight.
Certainly, there's obviously so many things that seem to have been been missed here in this. Uh, when you have the reality here for there being another confession going on, you have the reality here that other people with a lot of information that just simply weren't heard and didn't get into the case and didn't get into the courtroom because of Judge Gull. How is an appellate court going to look at that? Are they going to consider where this case was tried when it goes forward? I guess who determines where this would be tried again if it does get to go back to court? Does it just automatically go back to Gull? Or somewhere along the way, does an appellate court or some other entity say, let's not do the same thing we did again? Let's actually try this again, but with different characters and actors in this. So maybe we can get a more unbiased look if in fact they look at this and go, this seemed a little bit biased.
In all likelihood, if there is a new trial granted, it's going back to that same court division. And so, unless Gull has had a rotation or chooses to recuse herself or something like that, it could very well go back to her. And so, that would be a victory, kind of, but the defense would still be contending with some of the same ostensible unfairness that came from Judge Gull, and they would have to contend with that at the second trial.
So if you're dealing with an unfair judge, you're dealing with investigators that seem to not really know what they were doing and litany of errors along the way. It basically just gets pushed back into the same box and goes, hey, let's see if it fits better this time.
Yes, with some direction from the appellate court. Now, hopefully the appellate court would look at this and say, hey, Judge Gull, you screwed up on this part, not letting in this type of evidence. You need to let it in during the second trial. So the appellate court would have some control and hopefully rein in some of these purportedly unfair rulings from Judge Gull, but you're still dealing with the same cast of characters here. Hopefully, is the movie going to have the same ending? That would really be the question.
So the appellate court can say, look, you have to allow these things in. Does she have to follow it? Or can she find little caveats here and there? Because I'm not putting anything past her at this point for what she doesn't want into her court. She knows how to navigate this pretty well. Is there a way where they're going to say, look, you need to do it this way? Is that a mere suggestion, or is it a mandate that she has no choice in, and what we say goes in has to go in? And what sort of roadblocks can she put up by her own choice when these things would be submitted again, if they were to be?
Direction from an appellate court to grant a new trial based on errors usually involve a mandate to the trial court judge. Hey, you have to do this. You have to let in this evidence. You chose to exclude it last time. That was part of the error that contributed to the new trial. So you better listen to us. Judge Cole could, try to dance around that and talk around it or whatever. But I think she would be a fool to disobey the appellate court and potentially commit the same error that resulted in a possible new trial the first time.
Is there any compatibility for her? Should she dance around this and not admit what should be admitted? Should this go back to trial, or is it just kind of a slap on the wrist? Or, oh, that didn't work out well for you. Let's move you somewhere else. I mean, how does that process? Because we hear the words of, okay, this is mandated, this is the way it should be, and I think most of us go, oh, well, that's the way it should be. Until you get there and find out, oh, they don't really have to follow the rules after all. There's nothing that's gonna impede them from actually following it. What exists to make sure that a judge is impartial and actually does their job?
A huge issue, especially in criminal practice across the country right now, is judicial discipline. It's exactly what you're talking about, Tony. It's, the judges have this sort of black robe syndrome, and they, some of them, and they think that they are more important than God and they can do whatever they want. And there aren't great systems in place to rein that in and to ensure that they don't do that. There are complaints that can be made to a judicial disciplinary commission that can sometimes result in censures and sometimes in suspensions, that kind of thing. But there aren't any criminal laws, and there aren't any really solid mechanisms to say, hey, this judge screwed up, she should have a consequence. Who are you going to tell? And what is that consequence really going to matter?
Hey, thanks for checking out the video. Be sure to follow us wherever you download podcasts, and especially Apple Podcasts, where you can get advanced episode and premium content on our premium channel right there. Also, be sure to follow us on social media so you don't miss any breaking updates on the stories that matter to you most. We're on TikTok, X, Instagram, Facebook. Just search Hidden Killers Podcast with Tony Bruschi, and you'll find us right there. Again, thanks for watching.